Ave Maria, welcome to the History Programme, a monthly series of programmes produced by the Franciscans of the Immaculate for Gate of Heaven Radio. In this series, we will be looking at events in history, famous people in history, including saints and blesseds, foundations of religious orders, and much more. In short, anything in history that has a Catholic perspective. Our objective will be to tell you the facts as recorded by history. We will not be entering into polemics nor aiming to generate any controversy. If we venture an opinion, we will say so. You are free to agree or disagree. This month's programme is entitled Glastonbury Abbey, Cradle of Christianity in England. In the Somerset region of England lies the ruins of an old Norman abbey, one of the most magnificent of all the medieval abbeys, an abbey destroyed during the reign of King Henry VIII. The name of the abbey was Glastonbury Abbey, and it lies on the ground of what is arguably the cradle of Christianity in that country. In this programme, we will look at not only the origin of Glastonbury Abbey and its destruction by Henry VIII, but also some traditions and even legends surrounding the area in which the abbey originally stood. When we are delving very far into the past, it is sometimes difficult to separate fact from legend, and the history of Glastonbury is no exception. There is a tradition that in the year 63 AD, that is, only 30 years after the death of our Blessed Lord, Joseph of Arimathea came to this part of England with some disciples. Listeners will remember that Joseph of Arimathea was a Pharisee, but a believer in the Lord, and it was he who helped take the body of our Lord down from the cross and place him in a tomb he had prepared for himself. Some even go as far as to say that Joseph came here with the boy Jesus much earlier on. This area is not far from Cornwall, an area rich in tin. Indeed, tin mines were abundant in Cornwall until recent years. So there can be no doubt that the trading ships from the Middle East visited the area in order to obtain tin for use back home. There is also a tradition near the Marseille area of France that Lazarus and his sister Mary Magdalene went to that part of France. So personally, I think that there is a strong basis for the truth of the tradition of Joseph's visit to England. In any case, the story goes that during Joseph's visit in 63 AD, the local king gave them an island called, in English, the Isle of Glass. This island is none other than the area in which Glastonbury now stands, although it is no longer an island. It is said that Joseph planted his staff into the grounds of a place called Wiriol Hill, the site of a pagan temple. The staff budded, and from it a thorn tree grew up. Joseph built a church dedicated to the Blessed Virgin Mary at the place. No remains of the church exist any longer. The thorn tree survived down through the years until it was destroyed by one of Oliver Cromwell's soldiers in the 17th century. However, some shoots of the tree were saved by local people and used in replanting the tree. The tree was unusual in that it bloomed around Christmas time as well as May. Sadly, just a few years ago, the tree was destroyed in an act of vandalism. It needs to be pointed out that in recent decades, there has been a tremendous growth in the occult activities around the town of Glastonbury. So this act of destruction to such an important Christian tradition should be no surprise to us. There is also a legend that King Arthur is buried in the grounds of Glastonbury Abbey. Listeners may recall King Arthur, the legendary King of the Britons. King Arthur and his Knights of the Round Table, their quest for the Holy Grail, has become part of English folklore. However, it has to be said that King Arthur's very existence is a legend in itself, and on this matter I will make no further comment. Glastonbury became an important shrine to the Blessed Virgin Mary. In 530, Saint David of Meneve, now the patron saint of Wales, accompanied by 7 of his suffragan bishops, came to Glastonbury and consecrated the chapel of Our Lady on the east side of the church. Saint David adorned the golden super altar with a sapphire, known as the Great Sapphire of Glastonbury. This precious jewel was later confiscated by King Henry VIII around the time the monastery was suppressed. The silver chapel of Our Lady was stored with costly gifts. Many Saxon kings came to Glastonbury on pilgrimage, including Edgar the Peaceable, who placed his sceptre on the Blessed Virgin Mary's altar and solemnly placed his kingdom under her patronage. In the early part of the 8th century, the King of the West Saxons had a church and a monastery built in Glastonbury. The church was dedicated to Saints Peter and Paul. However, the new monastery did not flourish for very long, as the 9th century saw the arrival of the Danes, who ransacked and destroyed everything in their path, including the monastery. The monastery was rebuilt, and with the arrival of Saint Dunstan, who later became abbot, was established as a Benedictine abbey. He remained abbot for most of the time, until he was eventually made a bishop. The Battle of Hastings in 1066 saw the beginning of the Norman conquest, and Saxon England began to wane. Unfortunately, Glastonbury Abbey was not immune from the Saxon-Norman rivalry, and the office of abbot interchanged between both factions. All we need to say here is that a great fire almost completely destroyed the monastery in 1184, and it took over a century, 1303 to be precise, before the monastery was fully restored. It is interesting to note that the earliest royal visitor to the church after the fire was King Edward I and Queen Eleanor for Mass in Holy Week 1278. It was during this period, until its suppression by Henry VIII, that the abbey became one of the great pilgrimage centres of England. In the year 1525, Richard Whiting was appointed abbot by Cardinal Wolsey. By all accounts, he was a model abbot, known for his learning, his piety, and his administration skills, and the abbey flourished under his tenure. He was still abbot in August 1535, when the abbey first came under a so-called visitation by one of King Henry VIII's commissioners appointed for such a purpose. This was the time of the dissolution of the monasteries, and here we need to pause from our story and examine what was this dissolution of the monasteries. The architect behind the dissolution or suppression of the monasteries was Thomas Cromwell. We do not have time in this programme to examine his life in detail, but we do need to say a little about him. Thomas Cromwell was from a relatively poor background, but he had made his fortune, so to speak, by working on the continent. first as a kind of mercenary in foreign wars, then afterwards by working in money-lending houses. On his travels he had read and liked Machiavelli. He was to use Machiavelli's tactics to terrible effect later in his career. He later moved back to England and went into business as a money-lender. He was shrewd in business and eventually ended up working for Cardinal Wolsey, who was then a key advisor to King Henry VIII. Wolsey had got approval from Rome to suppress some small monasteries in order to build his new college at Oxford, and he employed Cromwell in visiting these monasteries. When Wolsey fell from power after the failure of King Henry VIII to obtain an annulment from Rome, Cromwell went over to the service of the king. He may have been the one who made the first suggestion to the king of looting the church. Cromwell ended up as more than Henry's right-hand man. He was master and controller of Henry, and the king even delegated spiritual powers to him, so Cromwell could control the bishops also. In 1535, following the enactment of the Dissolution of the Lesser Monasteries Act, he began the dissolution of the monasteries and the convents. As we have already noted, he had had previous experience of this kind of work under Wolsey. The historian Hilaire Belloc has said of Cromwell, "He was the direct author of the great orgy of loot which follows henceforward for the better part of a lifetime, and his motives in this move was personal gain. The whole of his life had been devoted to acquiring wealth, usually by the basest means, and that sufficiently accounts for all that he did in the matter of the religious houses." Cromwell began by suppressing the smaller monasteries, just over 300 in number. Mr. Belloc says that these smaller monasteries represented about 1/4 of the monastic wealth of England. This is how Cromwell achieved it. The monasteries were visited and inventories were taken. False accusations of bad management and corruption would then be made, and property would be confiscated. The religious would then be either transferred to a larger monastery or sent home. Later, the decision was made to dissolve the larger monasteries. No law was enacted for this purpose, but instead more sinister means were employed, such as false accusation of treason, bribery of the abbots, or simple forced surrender, until all the large monasteries ceased to exist. The monasteries and shrines were looted, sacred images were profaned, relics were burned, sacred vessels were taken and sold, libraries were destroyed, bells and lead were stripped off the roofs and sold. Most of the wealth ended up not in the king's hands, but in private hands. Cromwell himself made a fortune, much of which he gave to his nephew, and later on this nephew was more than able to provide for his son, the future and the infamous Oliver Cromwell. So a nouveau rich class of men became prominent in England, rich from the wealth of looted monasteries. These men had a vested interest against any kind of reconciliation with Rome. Even during the reign of the Catholic Queen Mary I, this landed class forced a reluctant pope to allow them to keep stolen church lands. Before the dissolution, there had been about 800 monasteries in England. The monasteries were centres of learning and were known for their hospitality and charity to all. As the Protestant historian William Cobbett puts it, a monastery was the centre of a circle in the country, naturally drawing to it all that were in need of relief, advice and protection, and containing a body of men or of women having no cares of their own, and having wisdom to guide the inexperienced, and wealth to relieve the distressed. With the demise of the monastery, pauperism increased. There was nowhere left for the beggar or the vagrant to turn. So he ended up on the streets, or later on in the 19th century, in the workhouse. The writer G.K. Chesterton summarises the result so eloquently in his book, A Short History of England. We talk of the dissolution of the monasteries, but what occurred was the dissolution of the whole of the old civilization. Lawyers and lackeys and moneylenders, the meanest of lucky men, looted the art and economics of the Middle Ages like thieves robbing a church. Their names, when they did not change them, became the names of the great dukes and marquises of our own day. Sadly, nothing remains of any of these great religious houses nowadays except ruins. What a terrible legacy of greedy men. But now let us return to Richard Whiting, the Abbot of Glastonbury. The abbey had had its first visitation in 1535. Glastonbury was a model monastery. It was not just a magnificent building, but more importantly, it was a centre of sanctity. Not surprisingly, the commissioners had found everything to be in order. What was a surprise was that the commissioners allowed the abbey to survive, but it turned out to be only a short-lived reprieve. In September 1539, a number of Cromwell's commissioners arrived unannounced at the abbey to conduct another visitation. Abbot Whiting was arrested and sent up to London to be held in the Tower. He was questioned by Cromwell and eventually charged with treason. Whilst he was being held in the Tower, the abbey was ransacked and the monks dispersed. Cromwell himself gives us a written account of the property looted from the monastery. The plate of Glastonbury, golden to the weight of 11,000 ounces, much furniture, in ready money more than £1,100, many rich copes and other vestments, debts owing to the abbey of more than £2,200. After a short time in the Tower, Abbot Whiting was sent back to Somerset, to Wells in fact, and given some sort of a mock trial. The following day he was taken back to Glastonbury to be executed with two other monks, Dom John Thorne and Dom Roger James. All three were drawn on hurdles to the Tor Hill, which overlooks the town. There they were hanged and quartered. Abbot Whiting's head was placed over the gate of the now deserted abbey as a gruesome warning to others who might defy the new tyranny. The rest of his limbs were displayed in 4 different towns. The Glastonbury Martyrs, Richard Whiting, John Thorne and Roger James, were beatified by Pope Leo XIII in 1895. The Catholic presence in Glastonbury was restored in 1904, when the exiled French Sisters of Charity opened up a convent nearby. This convent closed in 1984. a small church was opened in 1926. Then, in 1939, just across the road from the ruins of the old abbey, the foundations of a new church dedicated to Our Lady was built. This church would be a successor to the ancient shrine of Our Lady of Glastonbury, and it now serves as the parish church. In July 1955, a new shrine to the Blessed Virgin Mary was opened in the church, and a statue bearing the ancient title of Our Lady of St. Mary of Glastonbury was blessed by the Apostolic Delegate. Thus, in the name of the Holy See, the shrine of Our Lady of Glastonbury was canonically restored. The statue was solemnly crowned by the Apostolic Delegate in 1965. A pilgrimage in honour of Our Lady of Glastonbury is held at the shrine annually in July. This episode of the History Programme was researched and presented by Fra Solanus for Gate of Heaven Radio. We hope you have enjoyed it and will join us again next month for another episode of the History Programme. For more information on Glastonbury Abbey, you could visit the parish website www.glastonburyshrine.co.uk. That's www.glastonburyshrine.co.uk. Ave Maria.